over the next 2 months, we're going to spend our Sunday evenings in the book of Ruth. Not all of them, obviously. We do other stuff on Sunday evenings sometime, but we're going to spend 5, including this week, 5 lessons in the book of Ruth. Part of the key of understanding Ruth, and we're going to spend the entire time on this idea, is becoming familiar with the context in which the story takes place. And I spend a lot of time talking about context. In the Old Testament, some of this is a little bit easier because we have multiple books that are taking place in the same time period. And so we can kind of gain an insight into what's going on sort of in the background of the story of the book of Ruth in ways that we can't in a lot of other stories. Judges 2:11 through 15. Judges is the backdrop. The book of Judges is the backdrop for the story of Ruth. The people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. This is after Joshua has died. He has led them into the land of Canaan. They've had some victory in war. They didn't drive everybody out, and Joshua dies, and now what are they going to do? Well, they're going to do whatever they want. They abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They went after other gods from among the gods of the peoples who were around them and bowed down to them, and they provoked the Lord to anger. So they abandoned the Lord and served the Baals and the Ashtaroth, and the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he gave them over to the plunderers who plundered them. And he sold them into the hand of their surrounding enemies so that they could no longer withstand their enemies. This is in context, again, of the wars of conquest. They have had great success under Joshua, battle after battle, victory after victory. And while Joshua was leading them, they're serving the Lord and faithful to him and doing what he wants for the most part, not entirely. But after Joshua's death, everybody just sort of goes their own way, and now they start losing in battle. They start losing to these enemies that are around them. Whenever they marched out, the hand of the Lord was against them for harm, as the Lord had warned and as the Lord had sworn to them, and they were in terrible distress. This is the repeated pattern throughout the book of Judges, is the repeated distress of Israel as they begin to be overtaken by their enemies. Verse 16, the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hand of those who plundered them, yet they did not listen to their judges, for they whored after other gods and bowed down to them. And you can see the cycle over and over. We're not going to study all the judges tonight, obviously, but you can see the cycle over and over of distress and physical despair, and we're losing, help us God, we need you, and then God's like, okay, I'll save you, and then he saves them, and they go right back to doing what they were doing before, and it just continually goes over and over and over and over. They soon turned aside from the way their fathers had walked, who had obeyed the commandments of the Lord. While the judge was around, they, for the most part, obeyed the commandments. Again, not entirely, but the judge would die and a new generation would come and do whatever they wanted. And they did not do so. When the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge, and he saved them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge, for the Lord was moved to pity by their groaning because of those who afflicted and oppressed them. And we did a series on Judges 2 years ago, because last year we did the story of the Bible. 2 years ago we did a series on Judges, and this verse is, I titled that series The Pity of the Lord, because the story of Judges is the story of the Lord's pity. They rebel, they do what God does not want them to do, they do whatever they want, and the Lord lets them be conquered by others as consequence and discipline, but then his pity continually moves him to save them again and again and again through the hand of the judges. So we come to the end of the book, and sort of the summary, we have the story of the judges through Samson. And then there's a couple of stories at the end that really are not connected, it's seemingly unconnected to the line of judges themselves, the story of Samson in Judges 16. Then we have a couple of stories at the end of the book that are sort of emblematic of what's going on in the land at the time. And we don't have time in this sermon. I would encourage you, if you're not familiar with the stories at the end of the book of Judges, to go read those, because they're kind of terrible. I say kind of. They're just straight up terrible. And the man Micah, Judges 17:5 and 6, had a shrine, and he made an ephod and household gods, and ordained one of his sons who became the priest. This is the setting for one of the stories at the end of the book of Judges, and it's this guy has a shrine, he makes a god, and he's like, you be a priest. And of course, so many things wrong with this. One verse. So many things wrong with what this guy's doing. But again, it emblemizes the second line here. In those days there were no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Whatever you want to do that. Just do whatever you want. That's what they were doing. And this guy, he has household gods that he just made up. He's just like, these are my gods now. I don't know what they were exactly, but then he ordains one of his sons. Okay, well, sons couldn't be priests. I guess they technically weren't priests because he just made it up, so it's not like they were priests to Yahweh. They were priests to this random god. And he just did it because it seemed right. It seemed right to him. I'm going to do this. Judges 21:25, at the end of the book, reiterating the point, in those days there were no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. It is a seemingly lawless, selfish era of Israelite history. I say seemingly because that's kind of how all of Israelite history is. You have David, who's a great king, and then you have Solomon, who's a good king for a while, and then goes off the deep end. The kingdom's divided. And then from the divided kingdom onward, at least half of the nation at all times is living under an evil king. All the time. So, you know, we give the time period of the judges a bad rap. Everyone's doing what was right in his own eyes. It's not like when they had a king that went away. It's not like they suddenly are like, oh, we have a king now. Let's obey God. That's not how it went at all. So, the way the Judges is phrased, in those days there was no king, kind of makes it seem like the problem was they had no king, but that wasn't the problem. This is just a historical marker before the kings. The real problem is everyone did what was right in his own eyes, and that continued to be the problem in perpetuity. And might I suggest, that is still the problem today. This is the problem of humanity, henceforth and forevermore. Everyone does what they want. So the story of Ruth, this is all set up, gains some of its power from the contrast. The story of Ruth is taking place in this period of time where everybody's just doing whatever they want, and yet the story of Ruth has several characters who don't do that, who are not just doing whatever seems right in their own eyes. They're doing what is actually right, what is right in the eyes of Yahweh, as opposed to what is right in their own eyes. And so it is in the contrast. Ruth is in some ways a powerful story because it's showing what could have been in Israel, what kind of behaviors we could have seen if Israel had been more faithful. It's toward the end, I don't know, middle or end. It's impossible to say for sure when it takes place, of this back and forth time of rebellion and redemption that the story of Ruth takes place. Ruth 1 and Ruth 4 both serve, the first verse and then the last few verses, serve as sort of chronological markers of the story of Ruth. In the days where the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and the man of Bethlehem and of Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and 2 sons. I will remind you, the country of Moab, not that far from Israel. You just go that way a little bit. From your perspective, what is that? That is northeast. You go northeast a bit, and then you're in Moab. It doesn't take very long to get to Moab from Israel. Ruth 4:18, these are the generations of Perez. He fathered Hezron, and he fathered Ram, and Ram fathered Amminadab, and Amminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon, and Salmon fathered Boaz, and here's our chronological marker. Boaz is one of the main characters in the story of Ruth. Right? So Boaz fathered Obed and Jesse and then David. That gives us a reasonable time frame for the story. Of course, the primary problem is we have no idea how old Salmon was when he had Boaz, or Nahshon when he had Salmon, or Amminadab when he had Nahshon. So we can't really place it exactly, but my guess is sometime in the time of Tola or Jer. In the time of the judges. You could go as late as Ibzan or Elon, I think, if you really wanted to do that. But again, it's hard to say exactly. That gives us a good context. In the time of the judges, when everybody's doing what they want, and there's this repeated time of rebellion and repeated time of distress and trial, and might I suggest that the famine in the land might be part of God's consequence for their continued sin. He told this to Israel over and over, that if you are not faithful to me, part of the consequence of that was your crops will fail. Your crops will not be good if you continue to persist in rebellion. So part of the famine that serves as the backdrop for the story of Ruth might be, and again we're speculating a bit here, might be a result of the repeated sin and rebellion and resistance to God's will that we see over and over in the time of the judges. Knowing the time frame helps us unlock the justice and redemption in the story of Ruth. Justice in Ruth stands in stark contrast, and I'll use the term social justice. I use this term a little bit hesitantly, except the problem is we can't let, this is a side note, but it's important, so I want to make it. We can't let people that are outside the kingdom of God co-opt language that is used in the Bible to mean what they mean instead of what God means. So part of that, when I use the word social justice, you might have a negative reaction to that. But when we think about social justice in Israel, justice for society, how society should order itself in such a way as to enact God's justice in society. We can't let other people co-opt that term, and we can never use that term again, because this is the idea that's biblical, and we'll talk about some of the verses that talk about this, stands in stark contrast especially to the behavior of Israel at large. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes, but the people in the story of Ruth don't do that. They do what's right in God's eyes. They do what's right in the way that they should be acting. The redemption of Ruth then is a microcosm, or sort of a symbol of God's own repeated redemption of Israel. Remember, they go off and they sin and they rebel, and God gives them into the hands of their enemies, but then he is moved to pity repeatedly. The Lord is moved to pity by their groaning because of those who afflicted and oppressed them. And so time and time again, God redeems Israel. He sends them a judge to save them, to bring them back out of their suffering and conflict and conquest, just like we see in the book of Ruth, serving as sort of a mini example, a microcosm of God's own justice and redemption in Israel. That is, Ruth and Naomi find themselves in a terrible situation, and they are redeemed by an act of mercy and grace and pity in the way that Israel is over and over in the story. So, Ruth emblemizes in some ways what Israel should have looked like during the time of the judges. And again, we're doing a lot of setup in this lesson to keep these things in our minds as we read the story of Ruth over the next 8 weeks, because we're going to miss a bunch of this, but over the next 4 lessons in Ruth, I want you to have these things in mind, that what God had in mind for somebody specifically in Naomi or Ruth's position. What did God expect Israel to do? Genesis 18:19, I have chosen Abraham that he may command his children and household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so the Lord may bring to Abraham what he has promised him. Abraham is chosen to instigate, to begin a people who will do righteousness and justice. And what did that mean specifically in the story of Ruth? Deuteronomy 10:17. The Lord your God is the God of gods and the Lord of lords, the great, mighty, and awesome God, who is not partial and takes no bribe. He executes justice for the fatherless and the widow, and loves the sojourner, giving him food and clothing. Love the sojourner, therefore, for you were sojourners. That for you were sojourners talks about Egypt, their sojourn in Egypt. They were supposed to be in Israel, and Abraham was in the land of Canaan. It wasn't Israel at the time, but he's in that land, Abraham is. And then they sojourn over to Egypt for a while. Of course, the story of Joseph and the famine relief, and then they hang out for 400 years. I say hang out, they're in slavery for most of that time. And then God brings them out, and his reminder to them, you used to be like this. You were in a land that was not your own. You were at total mercy of another people. You were totally incapable of helping yourselves. And I helped you. I saved you. So you treat the fatherless, the widow, and the sojourner, the 3 categories of people in Israel who cannot help themselves. You treat them well because I treated you well. You couldn't save yourself. I did it for you. And so now you do that to those people in your land. This is social justice. Justice for a society, for people who cannot help themselves. And the Israelites were supposed to do it because God had done it for them. Cursed be anyone who perverts the justice due the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow. Deuteronomy 27:19. If you do not treat these people well in your land, cursed be you. We see in the story of Ruth what God intended for people to act in regards to the sojourner and the fatherless and the widow. How did God expect them to be treated? Well, in the story of Judges, we see everybody doing whatever they want. And in the story of Ruth, we see the contrast. This is what God had intended. This is how God intended people to be. She said, this is Ruth speaking in Ruth 1:15 and 16. See your sister-in-law, this is Naomi speaking. See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. But Ruth said, do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. Where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge, and your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Remember, his family had gone to Moab. Actually, it's this way from your direction. Moab, over here. His family had gone to Moab. The sons and the father, they're dead. It's just Naomi and a bunch of women who are widows at this point. Naomi's going to go back. We're going to talk about this more next week, but we're sort of setting the stage here. Naomi goes back, is going to go back to Israel, and Ruth says, I'm going to go with you. And so Ruth sits at the intersection of several of the protected classes in Israel. The widow, the poor, the sojourner. She is all three of them. She is a widow, she is a sojourner, and she is poor. Right? So she's going to go back to Israel and be at the intersection, and we read a bunch of, and I would encourage you, I put 3 verses up here. I would encourage you, if you have not done so recently, to do just a simple word search in the Old Testament, specifically in the Pentateuch. That's the books of the law. Just do a simple word search for sojourner or widow, and see how many times God commands specific behaviors and attitudes towards the sojourner and the widow. It wouldn't take very long if you just do a simple word search. You just see all the commands that God has in regards to that. Ruth is the epitome of this kind of person. She is this person in many ways. She serves as this stand-in for the people of Israel as a whole. Her attitude toward Naomi then is a strong condemnation of Israel's selfishness in this time. Israel is exhibiting selfishness in the fact that everybody's doing what's right in their own eyes. Ruth's attitude is one of loyalty and sacrifice and dedication, which is particularly bad because Ruth is not even an Israelite. Ruth is not even part of the people of Israel. The Israelites, they're all being selfish. Here's this foreigner who's going to come back and be loyal and be self-sacrificing when the Israelites should have been doing that. But of course they weren't. The story demonstrates tangibly again what God is intending in these commands. So, as we consider the story of Ruth, again, I'm not going to go into it too much tonight, but over the next 2 months, thinking about the examples in the story for our own enacting of God's justice, our carrying out of what God expects of us in our own lives, not just in the story of Ruth, but how we learn from these examples in our own lives. Ruth fits into a pattern in the larger story of Jesus. There is a theme in Matthew 1, I'll put it up there, Matthew 1, 2 through 6. There, for the most part, genealogies in ancient times, Israelite genealogies, are almost exclusively via the male, the husband. They go from husband to father to father to father to son, right? So what stands out about Matthew's genealogy in particular, in Matthew 1, 2 through 6, is the inclusion of 5 women. I've only got 4 on the screen. You can figure out who the 5th one is. It's Mary, right? But up until this point, the 4. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, Judah the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar, and Perez the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of Ram, and Ram the father of Amminadab, Amminadab the father of Nahshon, and Nahshon the father of Salmon, Salmon the father of Boaz by Rahab, and Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David the king, and David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah. Each of these women are also emblematic of the way that people are unjust, the injustice of people, but also the redemptive work of God in working in these situations to bring about his plan. So God's redemptive work was not just for the Israelites, but for all nations, for the stranger and the sojourner in Israel, really symbolized by Ruth and Rahab. Ruth and Rahab, who do not belong to Israel, who are still a part of this chain of Jesus coming down to us through history. But of course, eventually, the redemption that God is wanting to enact is for all nations, not just for the Israelites, pointing to everybody. And again, we see this sort of being, this idea being sort of planted in the narrative as we go in the Old Testament. There are these inclusions of non-Israelites. And then, of course, the prophets, as we get later into the later parts of the Old Testament. Bennett, I'm trying to talk here, bro. Maybe he should be up here with me. then you guys could pay attention, because everybody's thinking about Bennett. That's okay. Let he who never had a child make noise in worship, cast the first stone. I remember one time my son, I'm preaching up here, my son just comes out from underneath the pews, crawling on all fours right there. It's a very vivid memory of mine. I just can't get it out of my head. He just was like, he escaped somehow, and he just came up. There he was. Anyway, the redemptive work is accomplished through disaster, sin, and injustice. And again, I'll read the names again. Tamar, Rahab, the wife of Uriah, and then coming, of course, to Ruth. I don't know how familiar you are with those stories. Not great stories. I guess the story of Rahab it's fine in a sense, except it involves the death of a whole city, so it's still not great as far as sort of pleasure goes. The story of Tamar, which we're not going to read, is a terrible story. I don't know if you're familiar with Tamar. You should go back and read the story. It's awful. It's just truly terrible. And when we think about God's use of such terrible injustice in the story of Tamar, bringing us to Christ. Again, this is in the genealogy of the Savior, right? Who is ultimately going to save all people from their sins, bring justice and redemption to everybody. God is using such a terrible story to accomplish his will. We think about the story of Ruth, which is ultimately founded on tragedy. There's not a lot of injustice. Again, we've already talked about the story of Ruth is a story of people doing righteousness for the most part, but it's still founded on tragedy. There's a famine, and then a bunch of guys die, and there's a bunch of widows, right? The father and all the sons, they all perish, and then Naomi and Ruth and her sisters, they're all left. What do they do? What are they supposed to do? And of course, Naomi calls herself such to be bitter. She is bitter in her soul because of the things that have happened to her. And again, the story of Ruth founded on such tragedy, such horrible situations that God is going to use to bring about his ultimate redemption. We can think about the story of Uriah's wife. Again, not a great story, as David really murders a guy. Murders Uriah. And again, God is using that injustice in bringing about his ultimate plan of redemption and really bringing justice to everyone on earth. God can use the tragedies of our lives to accomplish his great plans. And one of the things I think we learn about the story of Ruth as we go through the story of Ruth, if people are willing to act the way that God wants them to act, God can overcome anything that's going on in your life, anything that's happening. Now, maybe that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be alleviated of the suffering that you have. I'm reminded of Paul in 2 Corinthians 12. He pleaded 3 times, take this thorn in the flesh, whatever it was. And God says, I'm not going to do that. My power is sufficient. My grace is sufficient. My power is made perfect in weakness. So God overcoming the things that are going on in your life might not be the cessation of the suffering that you have, but nonetheless, if you are willing to act the way that God wants, he will use your life to accomplish his plan, to accomplish what he wants to accomplish. And we see in the story of Ruth, terrible tragedy, but because some people are willing to act righteously, most notably Boaz and Ruth, because they are willing to act righteously, God is able to use this story to further his ultimate plan for redemption and for justice. Again, not just for Israel, but for all people. So we're going to end with Romans 8:12. We're going to read a lot of Romans 8. Romans 8, as we think about how this applies to us, and again, this is an introductory lesson to Ruth. Obviously, we haven't talked a lot about the story of Ruth. We're going to do a chapter a week for the most part over the next 2 months. We're just going to do a chapter a week of the story of Ruth. But I want you to have these ideas in your mind. What does God expect of righteousness and behavior that in our context? How does he expect us to behave? What does God do in the story of Ruth that demonstrates his ability to use tragedy for his own ends? And then, of course, what does that mean for us? What do we see in our study of Ruth that we can follow? What examples of how people act can we emulate? Can we follow? Because ultimately, this is the point. So then, brothers, we are debtors not to the flesh, to live according to the flesh. If you live according to the flesh, you will die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live. The Israelites in the time of the judges are living according to the flesh. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And the reward they reaped from that was death. Literally death, in their case. That is, God lets them lose in battle. For our context, it's a little bit more symbolic than that, obviously. For all who are led by the Spirit of God are sons of God. You did not receive the spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but the spirit of adoption as sons, by whom we cry, Abba, Father. And again, the people in Israel at the time of the judges, isn't this what they're doing over and over? We thought we were your sons, please save us. As they are delivered into the hand of their enemies over and over and over. And of course, God is moved to pity and compassion over and over in the time of the judges. Even though they were rebellious and they were in this situation because it was their own fault, God still moved to compassion for them as he is moved for us. The Spirit himself bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God, and if children, then heirs. Heirs with God and fellow heirs with Christ, provided we suffer with him in order that we might also be glorified with him. Now, Peter makes the point more clearly. Let none of you suffer as an evildoer. That's what's happening in Israel, for the most part. They're suffering because of their evil. But not everybody. Naomi and Ruth, it doesn't seem to be the case that they had any serious sin that caused them to suffer. Their husbands and their father to die. It's not because they had some sort of grievous sin. We think about a lot of the people in Israel who may have been trying to serve God as best they could, but who nonetheless had to suffer because, for the most part, Israel were rebellious. People are suffering as followers of God in that story, and for the most part, they don't receive until God is moved to pity the relief that they crave. Again, we think about our own situation. We are heirs with Christ, children of God, like the Israelites were. We are heirs. They were the heirs, of course, of the land of Israel. We are heirs of the promise of Jesus. And as we are crying out to God in our suffering, crying out to God in our difficulty, don't you think if he was moved to compassion for the Israelites, he will be moved to compassion for us? Us who share in his Spirit, us who are the children of God. As he was moved to compassion and pity for them, he will be moved to compassion and pity for you. The Spirit helps us in our weakness. Verse 26, we do not know what to pray for as we ought, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words. He who searches the hearts knows what is the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. We know that for those who love God, all things work together for good for those who are called according to his purpose, even though it doesn't seem like it in the moment. I'm adding that as we think about the story of Ruth. Naomi and Ruth. They are over in Moab. Moab's that way. They're over in Moab. Their husbands have died. Do you think that they were thinking to themselves, oh, God's going to make this okay. God's going to work this for good. Naomi's definitely not thinking that. Naomi's thinking that God has abandoned her. God is somehow punishing her, maybe. I don't know. But she's bitter in her soul. So she moves back to Israel. I wonder at what point in the story, and we'll talk about it when we get there, does Naomi begin to think, oh, God is going to work this out? When does she make that transition? And I don't know what's going on in your life. You might feel abandoned by God because of some suffering that you have. I don't know what it is. I know you got stuff because you're a human and you're like everyone else. At what point do you make the mental transition to, oh, God is working this out. God is going to make this okay. And for a lot of people today, the answer might not be ever until judgment, when God makes all things right. Everything's going to be made right and just in judgment. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, in order that he might be the firstborn among many brothers. This idea of the foreknowledge of God, the predestining, we're not going to talk about predestination, except to say this. The story of Ruth happens because of the foreknowledge of God. She's in the genealogy of our Savior. The story that's happening 3,000 years ago is happening because God knows this is what needs to happen to save everyone, to bring all people that are called into the image of his Son. That's happening in the story of Ruth as we read it. That's part of the story of the foreknowledge of God leading us to Jesus. And I think when we read the story of Ruth in that light, in that context, we're reading the story of Ruth recognizing that what is happening is going to directly lead us to Jesus. It takes on a whole new flavor, a whole new power. For a story that maybe if you've never read it before, it's in the Old Testament, why would we study this? Because the story of Ruth is part of this process. The process of God predestining those to be conformed to the image of his Son, in large part through the actions of Ruth and Boaz in the story, bringing us to the Savior. And those whom he predestined, he also called. Those he called, he justified. And those he justified, he also glorified. As we conclude, we're going to go again over the next month, 2 months, the story of Ruth. I want to encourage you, as you're reading the story of Ruth, I would encourage you to read it. If you haven't read it this week. Read it on your own. It's 4 chapters. I believe in your ability to do that before next Sunday. As you're reading the story, be thinking about how God worked in that story to bring about your salvation. The story has direct bearing on you, because it is through that story, in part, that Jesus eventually comes to earth and dies and is buried and raised again. We talked about it a lot in 1 Corinthians 15. Jim and I both talked about it this morning. I delivered to you of first importance that Christ died and was buried and was raised. That's the first most important thing. That could not have happened without the story of Ruth. It just wouldn't have happened the way that it did without this story that we're going to be studying. So we offer the invitation. We're going to sing the Lily of the Valley. That's the invitation song. I hate it when I lose words, Brandon. You're like, how many times have I said invitation song? And then the word just leaves my brain. I don't know what's going on. I have found a friend in Jesus. He's everything to me. I hope that's true for you. Maybe it isn't. If you're here tonight and you're not really quite sure if that is true for you, well, let's make sure that it is before we leave. When will Jesus come back? I don't know. You don't know either. So let's make sure that we're right with Jesus before we go home. If that's what you need to do tonight, let's do it tonight. Maybe you have questions about what's going on. You're not sure what to think about religious things, and you just want to have a study. I'm happy to do that too. I love studying with people. Whatever it is that you need, come while we stand and sing.